Hey everybody, and welcome to a very special Labor Day bonus edition of Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Noah, and today I'm joined by a friend of mine, Jeff, who is the perfect guest for today's bonus episode because he is not only a public school music teacher in Lower Manhattan, he is also a former employee of the International Association of Ironworkers, SEIU 1199 Northeast, and the Foundation for Fair Contracting. His first degree is in industrial and labor relations. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you today. I've been listening to the show, and I really like what you're doing over here.
Oh, thanks so much. All right, so to mark the holiday, we are going to spend some time today on a topic in recent news that is shaping up to be something of a threat to our union. For that reason, we're going to go a little out of order. Ordinarily, I would want to introduce the union first and explain what purposes it serves before diving into all of the entities who would prefer that we not have a union. But this particularly unlikely threat is a little time sensitive. So the hope is to do our part, however small, to sort of head it off at the pass. A more comprehensive journey into the United Federation of Teachers, or UFT, will be part of a forthcoming episode. For now, the threat to which I refer is a small organization we would like to keep small, if not non-existent, called Teachers for Choice. Note, I'm not talking about Teachers' Choice. We like Teachers' Choice. I'm talking about Teachers for Choice. But before we dive into that, Jeff, you have one of the best teacher origin stories I think I've ever heard. It's the kind of teacher origin story that restores my faith in the profession whenever I think about it. So I wonder if you might be willing to share some or all of it with us before we get into some of the dark stuff we're going to explore today.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for saying that. That's it's very kind of you to say. Feels good for me to hear it. So I got my bachelor's degree in 2009, like you mentioned, in labor relations. Went to the Cornell School of ILR, where I got a bachelor's of science, and I worked in the labor movement for about 5.5 years in a combination of roles. And that was a career. It's funny to say that your first career was your second choice to begin with, but I'd always wanted to be a musician as a kid, and that wasn't really encouraged by my family. So I kind of went down another route, thinking I would be a lawyer. And in college, I really just had like a political awakening. And it's kind of trite, but it's true, so I may as well just share it. In a class I took in my senior year, we were assigned the text, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Mm-hmm. And the teacher I had was a really amazing teacher who really held our hand as we worked through that text, which was very challenging for me. And it was in the context of a class called Migrant Workers, where he was a historian, and we were learning the history of migrant work, focusing on the United States. Mm-hmm. And then, we did a number of amazing things, like meeting with farm workers, doing ESL tutoring for them, things like that. So that really sparked my interest in joining the labor movement, because I, as a 21-year-old child, I thought, I want to do something to change the world, right? To leave it better than I found it, or at least to help people. And in my mind, it was to kind of help people to experience power in their lives, right? As kind of hokey as that sounds, but understand what power is and how it is exerted on them, and then what options they have with the conditions that they have, and how do they work with others and build a community to act collectively.
Yeah, I think a lot of teachers listening that'll sound familiar to them, just a different means of exploring that purpose.
Yeah, And I've met a lot of union organizers. It's obviously something I don't do anymore, so there's a reason I left. And those folks are a lot like teachers. A lot of them are former teachers, and they're just very good at helping people make sense of things. Mm-hmm. And so I did that for a number of years, and it wasn't what I felt called to do. I kept wanting music to be more a part of my life. Mm-hmm. I went back to school to study music, and I knew that teaching was where I really thought I wanted to go, right? Yeah. So I thought that I could do with teaching what I wasn't really succeeding at doing with labor organizing.
Gotcha.
And I think I have a better aptitude for working with young people. And I really wanted to work in elementary school because I felt like working with very young people gives us a chance to sort of, build it from the ground up, and to help children to understand, that where they are in relationship to everyone else that shares the world, and what does that mean,
Yeah.
So I went back to school, and that's where you and I met when I was getting a master's at Teachers College. Right. And I got certified to teach in New York City, and I've been teaching for a DOE school this is going to be
this is year 5, right?
5th year. That's right.
Nice.
I just got tenured.
Excellent. Congrats.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's kind of a relief. I mean, it doesn't kick in until the first day of year 5, so we gotta we gotta be careful.
So yeah, right. Yeah, So maybe you might want to take that part out, because it's like unofficially.
Yeah,
told.
we gotta knock on wood for that. I think a little knock on wood ought to cover us.
Okay.
So the reason you're here with us today is not only to hang out, of course, but because you bring a particular expertise in being at the sort of the crux between, at least as far as your adult career goes, you've done a little bit of both labor and being a laborer who belongs to a union. So I think that this is just the perfect day, the perfect episode, and also because it's sort of a pressing thing for us to talk about, the perfect time. So let's get into it. I first encountered Teachers for Choice when I saw a video of a protest at Foley Square, mislabeled, in my opinion, NYC teachers protest vaccine mandate. We'll add some audio from that video in just a minute, but just to set the scene, this video shows a gathering of about 200 people at the most, but they're packed in pretty densely, and none of them are wearing masks, which is especially worrying considering that this is an anti-vax rally. There is a "Don't Tread on Me" flag featured prominently right behind the speakers, along with some handmade signs reading things like "Freedom" and "Last year teacher, this year unemployed," "My body, my choice," and "I call the shots." One key piece of information excluded in this particular video that News 4 caught in their own coverage is that only about half the protesters are actually teachers, which would make the other half, I don't know, allies, people co-opting the title of our profession for the purpose of pushing a nefarious agenda. You be the judge. But let's go ahead and have a listen to this video.
USA! USA! USA!
We work for the DOE, and they're telling us that we can't come to work unless we're fully vaccinated. And we worked all year without a vaccine. Our children were protected. We wore masks, we social distanced, we've done everything that we've been asked, and we worked during an entire pandemic, and we were okay. So now they're switching things up on us, and we're angry.
I'm a centrist, I like liberty, and I would prefer to die a free man.
I am prepared to end this now, and I am officially announcing my exit from the UFT.
So
is yes. Because I do not believe that this is just about a vaccine. I do not believe that this is just about our health. This is about medical freedom. This is about totalitarianism. This is about... That's exactly right. We are headed into a very dangerous area. And if we comply with this, we are setting a terrible precedent for our future.
Yikes.
Yeah, oh God, listening to it, I just felt like almost like I was detached from reality. I'm just kind of almost like floating there, just like, I can't believe this is real life. Like, these are real people who, it's hard to take things like that, at face value, and you want to, but it's like, who did we really hear there?
Right.
Were those people, they said they were teachers, but were they really? And,
Right.
and like, what is their point if they're not teachers? Why do they want to have a say on this issue? And I just, of course you think about how, like, well, we have to get inoculated for a wide range of diseases in order to, like, work in the DOE. Like,
Right.
you have to.
Yeah,
And,
there's
like,
a ton of paperwork in order to just be let into the building,
Every
and
school-
that's for a reason.
yeah, every school that I went to along the way to certification, from undergrad all the way through to master's, requires proof of inoculations against a whole range of stuff. So I just don't understand. And we get, like, getting the flu shot every year is very popular among teachers.
Right.
And I mean, yeah, this is a somewhat small group of people whose voice is being amplified, but it's just scary that they are putting on loud rallies with, like, PA systems and
Yeah.
news coverage and all this. It's frightening.
Right. And even if it is just a few teachers, which it is, the estimate from News 4 suggested that it was probably about 100 teachers, and that's in sort of in line with what this organization has put out as well, that they've got about 100 really motivated teachers. Any sort of press that says NYC teachers protest vaccine mandate, without the caveat that, like, sure, some of these people happen to be NYC teachers, but, like, for the most part, teachers are like pretty happy about the mandate, because it means that this thing that we already did of our own volition because we want to be safe means that our colleagues are also going to do this thing, and that's going to make us even safer, and it's going to make the students even safer, especially the ones who aren't old enough to get the vaccine themselves. But this idea of, like, I would rather die a free man than to what? Get a vaccine? You want to die instead of getting a vaccine? Is that such an onerous idea that you're willing to die? That's a big step. Dying's a lot, It's
Yeah, it's part of, and it's kind of reminds me of many of the reactions that I've gotten from people who resist wearing masks, who resist getting the vaccine, is this idea of, like, if it takes me, it'll take me.
right.
And, like, it's this one kind of interesting reaction to death that people have, which is to, like, dismiss it, to, like, take this security of, like, well, I'm not afraid of it happening anyway, so why should I care? And I suppose that's fine if you're gonna take up, like, an extreme sport or something like that. I don't know. I mean, there's really just no death happens in isolation. I don't care what it is.
Right.
You could die in a skydiving accident, or you die from COVID. Like, that has effects on the rest of society.
Absolutely.
And we put conditions on these risks that people can take as a way of collectively saying, like, yeah, people should be free to take risks and pursue happiness in the way that makes sense for them. But at the same time, we have to put some limits on each other's behavior in order to protect everybody else's right to live. You know? Like, what about my right as a person to not die of COVID? Like, I would like someone to protect that right for me, you know? And that's, like you said, that's how I feel about this vaccine mandate. Like, I got it. I want it. And I want everybody else to have to do it too, you know? Or this might not be the right job for you, you know?
Yeah, it's because when it comes right down to it, this is a service job. We are providing a very important service to people. It's not in a lot of respects with this job, you're doing stuff sometimes that you don't want to have to do. Nobody, I won't say nobody, because there are certainly those of us who are, you know, I actually enjoy planning. I get a kick out of planning. So I won't say nobody wants to sit down and lesson plan, because in the right circumstances, you know, a cup of coffee, Saturday morning, some jazz in the background, right? Lesson planning can be really nice, but there are a lot of things that we like. I don't want to do a fire drill. I understand it's important though, so I do it. And if I
or like I didn't really think about this when I was in school for a teacher, but like the effect that like active shooter drills have on me and my psyche, you know, and the way that I even like relate to my students,
right? And
yeah, I mean, like, I think it's kind of a good example of, like, you know, you're doing an active shooter drill and there's a kid who is in the class who just really needs attention and wants attention from his peers and the adults and kind of acts out during one of those. And then you as the adult in the room are forced to have this conversation with a child about, like, well, you see, if you do that, if there was really someone in the building that wanted to hurt us and you did that, we would be in a lot of trouble. We'd be really hurt. And it's just I don't want to do that. You know, I don't want to have that conversation with anyone ever, but I'm forced to by my job. And we can talk about how those things are mandated. But I think this is a somewhat separate issue in that, like, there's not the same amount of trauma inflicted in just getting a shot, right? You know, and also we're doing it to keep each other safe, right? Which is why we do those drills, which is why we prepare. And this is an issue that people are making an issue. It's not really an issue, I don't think, in the minds of most New York City teachers.
Right.
I think most
approximately
of us
80% of us, according to Mulgrew, when he talked to the press, he said about 80% are probably vaccinated, maybe 90%, just because the records weren't fully up to date with teachers who went out and got the shot on their own. Clear majority of people like want this vaccine and have already gotten it. Right. So it's, you know, from that point of view, I feel safe going back to work. But this is one of those times when people are talking about an issue, talking about this issue in a way that's like really disconcerting and really troubling. Yeah. Right. So with that, let's get into what these people are saying. So in their own words,
Teachers for Choice is an organization comprised of teachers and parents that are 100% against forced medical mandates for any American to keep their job, especially educators. Right now, the most pressing concerns are forced COVID vaccination being forced on educators and most American to keep our jobs. However, there are many other medical mandates that are coming soon, and we stand in opposition to all of them. There are 4 major actions educators, union members, and all Americans can take to have your voice heard. Follow this blog and help us on social media. Sign our petition against vaccine mandates. Contact us and spread the word. We need as much support as possible to show union leaders and politicians we are a sizable political force. We have recently formed a steering committee for the group. If you are a teacher or educator in New York interested in being part of our committee, please contact us.
So just to point it out, Jeff did not misspeak. They spelled COVID coived. And this is the about section of a website devoted to opposing the COVID vaccine. So that's it's a little,
maybe not an ELA teacher that they asked to write it,
right? Or maybe somebody who doesn't have a friend to proofread, which is that's. Proofread your friend's stuff. It's important.
Yeah. And ask for proofreading, like humble yourself, right? Like
absolutely.
We shouldn't all just go unfiltered into the world.
That's for sure. This show will be edited at least a little bit just to make sure that we're not making huge mistakes that nobody wants to hear or read. So the real work of Teachers for Choice seems to be organizing rallies, of which there have been 3 so far. The audio you heard was from the third one, and there's a 4th one scheduled for the first day of school. The first 2 protests took place outside of UFT headquarters in December 2020 and June 2021, respectively. You might be thinking, wait, the vaccine mandate is brand new as of August 2021. What were they protesting in December 2020? Well, it turns out that the 100 people who turned up at the UFT headquarters in Staten Island were opposed to the testing requirements in school. And then in June 2021, also before there was a vaccine mandate for teachers, roughly the same number of people showed up to the UFT headquarters in Manhattan to express their opposition to the mask mandate. So it would seem that the common thread is not actually the vaccine, but COVID skepticism. It's not a vaccine skepticism. It is a COVID skepticism that has spread to the vaccine as well. So this hopefully goes without saying, but COVID skepticism is dangerous and has absolutely no place in our schools, where roughly half of the students are too young for the vaccine. And of the roughly half over the age of 12, plenty will live with people who will not allow them to get vaccinated due to skepticism of one sort or another. Meanwhile, there have been over 1 million cases in New York City and nearly 34,000 deaths. Even now, in September 2021, we have a 7-day average of 14 people dying of COVID every day. And that figure is trending upwards. And we haven't even gone back to school yet. Teachers for Choice is not solely devoted to organizing these skeptic rallies, though. They have allied with the Health Freedom Defense Fund, which is a shady organization founded by Leslie Manookian that organizes anti-mask, anti-testing, and anti-vaccine mandate lawsuits. From her webpage, here is more about Manookian.
Leslie Manookian is the president and founder of Health Freedom Defense Fund, a nonprofit which seeks to rectify health injustice through education, advocacy, and legal challenges to unjust mandates, laws, and policies that undermine our health freedoms and human rights. She is a former successful Wall Street business executive and award-winning documentary film producer and writer. She writes and speaks on topics of health, freedom, nutrition, personal development, politics, and more. She chose to leave Wall Street at the height of her career in order to pursue this more meaningful path. Leslie serves on the boards of the Weston A. Price Foundation and Health Freedom Idaho. She is a qualified homeopath, nutrition and well-being junkie, and a health freedom advocate. Originally from Idaho, Manookian's career in finance took her from New York to London with Goldman Sachs. She later became director of Alliance Capital in London, running their European growth portfolio management and research businesses. She learned of the vaccine debate while living and working in London and determined that one day she would make a documentary exploring the issue. She conceived, wrote, and produced The Greater Good, an award-winning documentary fulfilling that dream.
So this Leslie Manookian character is she's a qualified homeopath. I don't know what that qualification
Qualified
is.
health food junkie.
Right.
It was hard to get through a lot of that just because every title raised new questions, you know. Health freedom, qualified health freedom advocate.
Right. And before that, though, she was a successful Wall Street business executive, not to be confused with the unsuccessful.
And she left at the height of her career,
right?
As a gift
you do,
to
right?
all of us, to all of humanity. You know, you can really see the parallels between my story and her story, where like I was working as an underpaid union organizer, and she was financing things, and we both just at the heights of our career were like, we have to put this behind us and go into education. You know? I really identify with that.
Right.
How does she find time to do all these things? Like,
you know,
homeopathy, that has to take up so much of your time.
Right. Getting your qualification too. That's the big thing.
And just all the distilling they have to do, you know, it seems very time consuming.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, when your first career was as a successful Wall Street business executive, probably you've got a little, you know, financial
and a
cushion.
Major part of your skill set is just making up jobs for you to do. You know, that's one thing you learn in these powerful corporations, which is that like, well, this job is made up, so any job could be made up. I can just make up a thing. I can say a string of words, and that's a job for me.
Right. Let me work on my about section. I guess that's what job creation is really about in this day and age.
Yeah.
But anyway, I found a great episode of a podcast funded by a conservative think tank in which Manookian spouts off some utter misinformation, just complete nonsense about masks and vaccines. It's the kind of stuff that like gets you kicked off of social media because it is dangerous. So I won't include that in the show in the off chance that a listener is like dropping the needle mid-show and leaves under the impression that I had an anti-vaxxer here. But here is a different clip that I thought was pretty great.
I'm sorry, I do not believe that it was ever about a virus. They did not do that, the masking thing, because of the virus. It was to condition us. This is my opinion. People can disagree with it, but it was to condition the populace to accepting authority, authoritarian intrusion into our lives, our privacy, how we live. And I've written on my blog at lesliemanookian.com that post about, and it's entitled The Slow March to Authoritarianism. And it's all about how the foundation for this medical authoritarianism or authoritarian disease management has been laid for over 20 years. And here we are. And so I think people have to understand that that's really what the masks are about. In my own hometown, if you go into the grocery store without a mask, you may be physically assaulted. That's what's happened. And there have been several fights, even at 8 o'clock at night when there's nobody around.
Wow. Well, Leslie, you're making some big statements about mind control, and you're really bringing some new information to bear. And I hear what you're saying about mind control. It sounds so, I almost want to say, implausible.
I cut it right there because it does sound implausible.
I can't imagine why it would sound implausible. I mean, all of that was just clearly a sober recitation of facts and a reflection of reality as it is. I mean,
right. Well, she goes on to ask for like further examples of you know how the anti-vaxxers have been and anti-maskers have been mistreated, and so Manookian like lists off all of these ways in which they've been mistreated, which was hard to listen to because like you know if you were in New York last summer, you saw what totalitarianism actually looks like. You know if you were out at any of the protests that were happening, it was, you know, there were as many fully uniformed riot gear police officers as there were protesters at so many of these gatherings. And it like, you want to talk about totalitarianism? Like
yeah. And what I keep thinking about while listening to her is, you know, first of all, this is someone who is providing financial backing to a group that purports to be part of the New York City Teachers Union.
Right.
So that's always something I think that's important to just like put a pin in when you're listening to someone like that, because it's why. And when I ask that why question, it kind of leads me to just thinking about like, what interest does this libertarian person have in making these kinds of appeals? Why do they care? And I think part of it is that they want to erode the common elements of society. And what they want to be left is that structure of contract enforcement, which is the police, right? Like this idea that the police exists not to do public safety, but to ensure that property is respected, right? And so, and that's basically all they want it to be. They want instead to be the ones to purvey the information, so that they'll be unencumbered by collective will, kind of stepping in and advocating for a majority of people. Like they want to be able to exert their influence and exploit people.
Right. People who don't have property and so who don't really benefit from this massive contract enforcement organization.
Yeah.
Right. So Teachers for Choice is soliciting donations that go to the Health Freedom Defense Fund, which is Manukian's organization. The platform used to collect the donations, called Anadot, I'm pretty sure is how you pronounce it. Maybe Anadot.
Anado.
Anado.
Maybe they're like French.
Could be that. And I mean, the guy who developed it was trying to. His name is Paul Dietzel, but he's a former Republican congressional candidate in the state of Louisiana. So maybe it is a French. Who knows? At any rate, it is primarily a political fundraising tool for Republicans. I found an article in which Dietzel was responding to the accusation that his platform was meant to draw support away from then President Trump, who was using Win Red, which is the Republican analog to Act Blue, which is the Democrat one. A lot of Never Trumpers were fundraising using his platform, which prompted some GOP higher-ups to question his loyalty to Trump. And so here's what he said, and this is a direct quotation.
Anadot has more Republican customers than all other platforms combined, nearly all of whom support the president.
So, to summarize what we have learned so far, Teachers for Choice, not Teacher's Choice, remember we like that, $250, Teachers for Choice are COVID skeptics turned vaccine skeptics. They are attempting to organize teachers in opposition to the vaccine mandate for public school teachers in the New York City Department of Education taking effect September 27th. They organize rallies with a handful of protesters and collect money for a shady organization run by a former Wall Street executive turned health misinformation enthusiast and peddler that launches lawsuits against government mask and vaccine mandates. What does this have to do with our union and our common interests as workers? The final action recommended by Michael Cain, who's the founder of Teachers for Choice, is to leave the UFT, to leave the United Federation of Teachers, our teachers union, that provides for us the clout that we need in order to have healthcare, in order to get the salaries that we get as New York City teachers. He's telling us to leave. Here is a post from the Teachers for Choice website.
As many of you know, I publicly announced I am leaving my union, the UFT, during Teachers for Choice's August 25th protest at City Hall. Leaving the union does not mean I am leaving my NYC DOE job. Not at all. It just means I will no longer be paying union dues to the UFT while I teach in NYC. I strongly encourage every UFT member to follow me now, and below is complete instructions on how to do so. I am leaving the UFT because they are supporting forced vaccination for me to maintain employment as a teacher with no testing option in lieu of vaccination. The UFT and AFT are completely derelict in their fiduciary responsibility to represent me, and after a full year of attempting to communicate and negotiate with them, I can no longer in good faith pay them one more dime. In fact, the UFT is so incredibly derelict, all other NYC unions are taking de Blasio to court for all DOE employees, while UFT President Mike Mulgrew shrugs his pathetic shoulders. Even DC 37, who represents school aides, is joining the lawsuit, while Mulgrew abandons his membership to snuggle up with Big Pharma and Democratic leadership in Albany and Washington.
So, Jeff, with such a small constituency, remember, this organization turns out about 100 people at rallies. I personally don't see a major credible threat here when I think about it. I think it's fascinating, and I can't help trying to climb into the mind of Michael Caine and his 99 fellow skeptics, and Lisa Manoukian, who saw the massive, vicious police response to the protests and rallies last summer and didn't have anything to say, but wants to call vaccine mandates totalitarianism. The last time I was at Foley Square, it was with about 500 people advocating for policy that would help us fight climate change, and there were about 500 police in riot gear as well. So I would suggest once again that anti-vaxxers haven't really encountered totalitarianism. But anyway, the question is, what are the possible consequences to our union and our common interests served by that union of this foolishness from Teachers for Choice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And these are big questions. I think I kind of want to start right now just by responding to a little bit of what I just read and what we just heard and some of the things that you brought up, and just sort of point out the way that they keep bringing up totalitarianism in regard to public health initiatives.
Right.
But you also described a kind of ideological purity testing that's happening in the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. And they are for sure proponents of totalitarianism. You know, like this person raising money was, questioned, like their loyalty was questioned. Mm-hmm. And it's just important, I think, to point out that they keep pointing out totalitarianism, labeling things that, and yet like their own organization and their own kind of ideological crowd is constantly, infighting about who can be the purist.
Right.
But to talk about, how this kind of thinking, because it's hard to say it's a movement, because mm-hmm. and I wanted to ask, out of those 100 people, does that mean it was 100 people showed up to the rally and 50 of those people were actually teachers, or like what does that 100 number mean?
Well, so that's their own calculating. That's their own tabulation of the people there. So I don't know if you can even call it a press release, because it's just stuff on like a pretty shitty WordPress site that they're maintaining. Again, without anybody reading over the copy before it gets pressed to the internet,
which are signs that it's not a big movement. Because if you look at rank and file movements within the UFT. Right. Like some of them are very well organized and have committees that run them. And are doing real organizing work to gain traction with their fellow members of the union.
And then outside of the union too, like Moore is very active, even outside of the UFT. It's and people really expend a great amount of energy in volunteer work for that movement, which I would call a movement.
Right. And its name means Movement of Rank and File Educators, but it's more than just the name, right? Obviously it really has become a movement, and it is part of a broader movement within the organized labor in the United States of rank and file. They call it kind of the rank and file movement. Like there's a very famous one like Teamsters for a Democratic Union, and others that have existed in other organizations, because people, I think union is something that a lot of people think they understand what it is, and they do to an extent, but there are certain nuances of it that I think sometimes surprise people. And unions, unions are institutions, right? Like they are public institutions because they are members of the public who've come together for common cause to collectively bargain, you know, and it's, you can look at them almost like any other kind of organization, you know, like a political party or something like that. But they, you know, it's people coming together, getting organized in order to advocate for their terms of conditions.
Yeah.
And, you know, to think about like, what are the ramifications of some group of people emerging within the UFT saying, stop paying dues, right? Like, don't, you know, remove your membership, don't pay dues. Mm-hmm. Because the union is doing something I don't like.
Right.
So I think people might hear that and go, oh yeah, of course. Like if he feels like this union is not representing him, he should have some kind of recourse. Mm-hmm. Right. Like he maybe should, if it's a really bad situation, like, oh, he should be able to sue them, like take them to court. Like if you're a doctor, didn't do a good job as a doctor, right? Like there's some kind of malpractice that happened, right? There should be some sort of redress.
Right.
And, or on the other side of it, like no one should be compelled to be a member of an organization that they don't want to be a part of. Mm-hmm. So that is the basis of a kind of counter movement that has really kind of always existed in the employment relationship. You know, like you always have employees and employers, mm-hmm. right? And I mean, you know, we don't need to make people, you know, review, you know, Capital by Marx or anything, but you know, like whenever an employment situation exists, you have two sides, right? Mm-hmm. And when one side has far more power than the other side, right? Like mm-hmm. the people who own capital have a lot more, like their thumb is on the scale when it comes to bargaining power. And people found like, oh, well, all the people in this workplace can get together and say, we all agree not to work unless you meet these terms.
Right.
And this existed, you know, throughout history and in the United States, in a pretty much unregulated fashion, up until the middle of the 20th century, mm-hmm. where people would get together and just organize. And that would be people who worked in the private sector, you know, construction workers, printing press employees, garment workers, railroad workers, and in the public sector as well. Like the postal union is like the first public sector union in the United States. Mm-hmm. And all throughout this time, the employers are on the other side of this movement, and they're saying, well, wait a minute, like the laws of this country, and also just philosophically, we believe that individual bargaining is the only moral way to conduct an employment relationship, where I, the employer, agree on an individual case-by-case basis on the terms of employment for every single person that works for me. Right.
Don't you want to be a rugged individual?
Right. And part of that being that rugged individual is like, well, I climbed my way up and I accrued this capital and it's mine, it's my property, and I shouldn't have anyone else telling me what to do with my property.
Right. Get your own.
Yeah. And if people want to rent their bodies to me in exchange for payment, mm-hmm. then that should be up to us individually, and it's not anyone else's business what, you know, the terms are of employment for each of my employees.
Right.
And you know, you can see pretty quickly how that sort of falls apart, right? You have people acting with impunity in a situation where they're just really exploiting people, and it's causing harm to the public good, right? So even before there were legal protections for unions, like unions became legally recognized institutions in the middle of the 20th century in the United States.
Right.
Before that, people were organizing into unions. That they existed as a thing for a long time before that, and kind of grew out of like guilds, like trade guilds that existed, in colonial times and had come over from Europe. So this legal recognition in the 1930s, comes in 1935 amidst the New Deal. It's there's a labor relations act called the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act,
which was part of that New Deal package of stuff, legislation, and that sort of thing.
And it makes sense because it makes sense that it would be part of that, because they were saying like this is a new deal for the American people, right? The vast majority of American people work for a living, and it is anti-democratic to have an economic system that is so deeply controlled by capitalists.
Right.
And so we need to have, like, the government of the United States has a moral obligation to mitigate these things in order to be a democracy. And something interesting about this, which is a theme that's going to come up more as we get into talking about like why, these folks, Teachers for Freedom or Teachers for Choice, sorry.
Right.
Yeah. Why Teachers for Choice would be telling people, okay, leave your union, but you can still keep your job. And that's an interesting question. Like, why would that matter? Why would leaving the union matter for keeping your job? So, this legal framework comes in the 1930s, and the government starts regulating what can and cannot be included in union contracts. And not only that, but the government is also establishing what unions have legal protection. So public sector unions are excluded from the Wagner Act, along with farm workers, and domestic servants. So like home aides, nurses, maids, nannies, domestic workers, farm workers, public sector workers are excluded from the Wagner Act.
Gotcha.
And, Franklin Roosevelt was very opposed to public sector unions. And the idea being that, the theory, right, is we live in a democratic society. So, or we have a democratic government, and the citizens of the country vote for their representatives.
Right.
And if you work for the government, then you're electing your bosses, and that shouldn't be allowed.
Huh. Okay.
That's kind of the theory. And it's a really strange kind of circular logic, but they're just like, their feeling is that like, oh, they'll just, be fleecing the people, and, public servants should be doing it out of the goodness of their heart and not because they expect to get like paid to do it. And if you're going to be a public servant, you need to learn to accept a lower standard of living. So the teachers' unions, existed in different forms all through this time. The American Federation of Teachers is like the first one, and they emerged in about 1916.
Okay.
So again, the early 20th century, and they bargain based on how much power they're able to accrue, like any union, right? And in New York City was one of the first places in the country to actually have a law regulating union membership for public service employees. So then the city decides that it's going to start regulating these contracts, because the federal government basically just says, we're not going to have a hand in that. We're handing that off to the states. And so every state regulates whether or not public service employees can form unions and have legal protection in doing so. Because again, anyone can be part of any organization they want to, but whether or not there's a law that says you can be fired or discriminated against for membership in that, right?
Right.
The
thing that makes it high stakes.
I mean, a common example people give is like, if your boss finds out that you're a member of the Ku Klux Klan and fires you, you're not protected, really. You're protected from being put in jail for that, as long as you haven't committed any crimes. You're just a member of that organization,
right?
Theoretically, right? But your employer is like, well, I don't want to employ you because of that, and that's okay because this is the public sector and we're operating as free people. But the government has now recognized, like, okay, but a union is different. A union is different than your gun club or your Lions Club, right? It's
or your hate domestic
group.
terrorist club.
Domestic terrorism group. Yeah, so that should be protected, but only for private sector employees. And at the federal level, they're just saying, we're not going to make a law on that. We're just going to let states decide for that issue.
Okay.
And so they do. And it kind of starts in New York at the municipal level. So the city government recognized it, and then the state government later on. And so teachers, eventually are able to gain recognition from the entire school system in New York City. And when you establish a union in a workplace, there are lots of issues associated with it, obviously. But one of the primary concerns is how do we fund the running of the organization in order to maintain the kind of bargaining power that we want, right? Like, you have to hire lawyers,
right?
You have to you have staff who are going to be, managing the various pension funds or healthcare funds. Elected officers, are they going to have a full-time salary or not? Like, these are separate issues, but there are costs associated with running a union. And so any union is going to want to figure out how it's going to fund itself, and also figure out how to prevent the erosion of its collective bargaining agreement by making sure that everyone in that workplace is working under the collective bargaining agreement.
Right.
Because what you often would have in the days before the Wagner Act, or just in any kind of employment situation where it's like, okay, well, these people over here are represented by the union and they're working under that contract, but we're now just going to hire people who don't want to be part of it. And then eventually, like, all the power of it is eroded as the number of members is outpaced by the number of non-members.
Right, because if you're going to organize a job action, but you only can like have half of the employees of the job doing the job action, then it's not a very strong job action.
Right. And that's how like collective power is often exercised by unions, but it's also just like, okay, I'm representing this number of employees. So it's kind of like the implied threat there, right?
Right. It's not going to come to that, but if it did, this is what we got.
Yeah. And it's also just you can speak with the authority of like, we represent all of the employees. Like, we've established that. So unions in the private and public sectors start to invoke a practice called the closed shop. And again, this is a practice that goes back to like the very earliest unions. Like, everybody that is working on this construction job, you've got to be union, or you can't work on this construction job. It's closed shop.
Gotcha.
And so that is, there's a very strong interest in having the workers' organization, the union, representing everyone within the unit that is bargaining with the employer.
Right.
like presenting this unified thing. There are, of course, like problematic elements of closed shops, and they get a bad reputation for a lot of reasons. Part of it is just because of the amount of discrimination that was happening.
I see. Okay.
Just historically in the United States. Pretty much every union in the United States has had a troubled past with discrimination. But that entered into the public consciousness because employers seized on that as a way to start to erode the collective power of workers.
Right.
Because union membership in the United States has never gone above 30%. 33%, I think, was the peak in like the 60s or 70s.
Right. And it's not because the other 67% were bosses.
No.
Contrary to,
that's a
your
percentage of
understanding.
workers,
Yeah.
right? Like, so the 33% of the total workforce, right? Like excluding company owners, like 33% of the workforce in the US
Yeah.
represented by unions at its peak. Now it's much lower. But employers were noticing that in sectors where there was a lot of union membership, like in the public sector or in automotive sector, that they couldn't, you can open up a non-union shop. Like you can go somewhere and like open up a factory to make cars, right? But people are going to come to work for you and they're going to apply for a job at the union shop and maybe apply for a job at your shop. And they're going to say, why am I making half of what they're making?
Right.
And they have health insurance and a pension and you're not offering that. And so you have to start offering that because people are, if the choice is between these two jobs, like everyone will choose the job with the better compensation.
Of course.
No matter what your ideology is, so there's this real concerted effort to try and erode that, like to try and erode union membership, to try and get people to be morally or politically oriented to individual bargaining. And there's this tension that exists between private and public sector workers. And so you've got public sector workers whose labor rights are regulated at the state level. So just because I feel like now I've kind of gotten far away from the question at hand. So this Teachers for Choice, they're saying UFT members, leave the UFT, but you won't lose your DOE job.
Right.
So how can that be? Right? Because we have a system in place where we had a system in place where you can work for the DOE if you get hired. But once you do, you have to pay either union dues or what are called agency fees.
Right.
So sometime after the Wagner Act in the 1950s, as kind of part of the Red Scare that was happening in the 1950s,
Right.
An act called the Taft-Hartley Act is passed. And that kind of, in many ways, is one first step toward doing away with closed shops. So it's that along with a series of court decisions at the Supreme Court and the National Labor Relations Board say that it's in a violation of the First Amendment to require anyone to be a union member. And again, they're talking about the private sector only, but we'll see how this gets applied to public sector in a moment.
Right.
So they're saying that you can't force anyone, you can't compel someone to be part of an organization, kind of like we were just saying.
Right.
And, on the one hand, that kind of makes sense. But on the other hand, you have to factor in the fact that like it costs money to run a union. It costs money to, take the time and resources to print the contract so people can read it, or like print newsletters so that people can understand what's going on in the union, or run an election so that it can be a democratic organization. These things cost money.
Right.
And so people contribute to it. And if you're going to work in this workplace, we are putting it in the contract that you have to be a member of the union and contribute toward that. So it was decided in some court cases that you could mandate people to pay agency fees, just the cost of collective bargaining. But unions do more than collective bargaining, right? In the eyes of the court. So unions, contribute to political campaigns, and because of that political activity, that is compelled speech. So if a union requires you to be a member and part of that membership money funds your political operation, you're compelling that person's speech.
Right. Which is why when you join the UFT now, if you want to contribute towards the political action of the UFT, that's a separate fund. That you elect to pay into.
Yeah, and it's something that exists in both the private and public sector because the state level governments adopted the same practices. Like, it was found to be unconstitutional for anyone to say you have to have this.
Gotcha.
So that has been taken one step further in 2018. So there was this case, Janus versus AFSCME, which sometimes people refer to just as Janus.
Yeah, that's how I've heard it.
Yeah, and it was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision in the case of a social worker who was working for either the state or municipal level agency, and he felt that his union, called AFSCME, which is one of the major public sector unions, that its political actions were a form of compelled speech, and that even if he just were to pay agency fees, it's still compelled speech because they're bargaining with the government. They're bargaining with democratically elected politicians.
Right.
And so even the very act of collective bargaining in the public sector is a political act. And so he felt like his speech was being compelled.
Yeah.
Now, the court decided that he was right, and it is now currently the law of the land that public sector unions cannot even collect dues or cannot collect agency fees at all. They're not called dues. So a member pays dues.
Right.
And it's just understood that part of those dues may go toward political action because you are agreeing to pay dues, and then you'll contribute a little bit more to your PAC. So an agency fee payer is choosing only to pay for collective bargaining. And they might, they could contribute to the PAC, I guess. I don't think anyone would stop them. But
then you might as well just be a member.
May as well just join.
Yeah.
So, anyway, so in this Janus decision, it was found, you can't compel people to pay even agency fees in the public sector. So that is what this organization, this AstroTurf organization, Teachers for Choice, is advocating that people do now. And this was that in 2018 there was this scary moment where the union was like suddenly messaging out to us, we need to have Janus conversations.
Right.
And as an organizer, it was interesting to see a union like the UFT suddenly realizing the gap in its own organization, internal organizing.
Right.
Right.
Because it's a strong union. If you've ever been in the UFT building in Manhattan, that's a big old. I don't know if they have the whole building, but it's the spaces that I was in. I was just like, wow, this is nice.
Yeah. And it has a lot of resources, and that is one example of its power. But its power is there are forces outside of the even its employment relationship that are trying to diminish that power just because of ideological reasons, being opposed to union membership in general, right? Feeling that collective bargaining is immoral, right? From their political point of view.
Yeah. And these organizations have bigger buildings and nicer spaces. Yeah.
Well, they might. And they might also not. They might just be on paper, right? And it's part of this, like, you see it with almost every social issue, right? There are astroturfing. Astroturfing is when you have like shadowy groups kind of funding each other in untraceable ways, or hard to trace ways. Like you have like political action committees, like are kind of an aspect of this astroturfing thing. So someone who wants their identity to remain a secret and is willing to fabricate a system to diminish this. Right. This woman who you quoted, Minukian.
Yeah.
Right. She's one of these wealthy individuals looking to fund things that will erode certain social institutions that protect working class people.
Right.
So in this case, it's public sector unions that have been targeted. And now she's targeting specifically the teachers union that we are members of.
Right.
And this is a small group of people. There are likely a number of agency fee payers that have stopped paying in the UFT already. And I don't have those numbers on hand.
Right.
I saw some numbers for AFSCME and the SEIU, which are the two biggest public sector unions. And like, this is just agency fee payers, keep in mind. So this is not dues
people
paying
who've
members.
left the union, but agency payers.
So people were not members of these unions, but they were working in workplaces represented by them, and they were paying agency fees, and they were government employees. So AFSCME saw a 93% decrease in agency fee payers following this decision. And the SEIU saw a smaller one, but it was big. It was a big majority of the agency fee payers just stopped paying.
Right.
So the organizing effort in the UFT was focused on dues paying members.
Right. And holding on to them.
Which is, it's an understandable reaction, but I would also, what I wanted to do was also talk to my coworkers who were agency fee payers and say, you should really be a member of this union.
Right.
Like it's silly for you to not be. And like, if you like the terms of your employment, then you should just be a member of this union. Like that's how they came to be. And even if you work just in this education system, charter schools aren't paying salaries and giving benefits that are comparable to the DOE because they're just generous, right? It's not an act of kindness for them to offer similar pay and benefits. They're doing it because people wouldn't work for those schools if they didn't do that. Right. Because why would you?
Right. And the ones that pay, you see a salary that's substantially more than what you would get at a DOE school. Right. The expectations in that workplace and the kinds of things that you are expected to, or that you have to do in order to keep that job, which is not guaranteed from year to year. Also, it's that they're getting what they paid for. The bosses are getting what they paid for.
Yeah. And so the question for me, of course, and I'm sorry if we went kind of far afield of the question, but I'm trying to like focus on, what's this specific group trying to do? So I see this effort as a front in the battle to erode public education in this country. There are lots of very wealthy people funding initiatives to just really do away with public school in general. And one way that they are trying to convince people to move away from public education is to not simply just defund it, which will reduce its quality, but they've also found that you can deprofessionalize it.
Of course.
And you can make it so that people can't do the work anymore. you know, like people who are, I've been going into my 5th year now, you know, and I'm single, and we don't own a home, and we're paying off student debt, my wife and I, and, we have to make certain financial choices when we're thinking about jobs to do. And if you can make it so that good people that want to stick with the profession and want to get better at it and improve at it while also living a life and like surviving and trying to work towards some of their dreams, they're going to have to go to other industries because they want to make teaching into a job, not a profession, right? They want to, and not just teaching. I mean, everybody who works in the school, right? Like everyone who work, and all of us are members of different of unions. Some of us members of the same one, but everybody that works in the building, it's
DC 37, UFT,
the SEIU, I think as well. And then there's another union for bus drivers. I mean, again, like these are, I'm not trying to say that the teachers are the only professionals in the building. Right. Like we are all professionals working with children, whether you're the bus driver or the person making the lunch or the person in the cafeteria or the person in the classroom. Right. Like, but they want to deprofessionalize these jobs and try to make it so that people will accept them, and people will accept lower working conditions and be less motivated and less engaged with the work, right? And as a way of saying to the public, look, I mean, these public schools, the quality is terrible. We need to privatize them in order to lift the quality of the education. Right. And so people often focus on charter schools as being like the one big thing that's like eroding teacher union power. And it's really only one element of it. And our ability to collectively bargain is constrained in lots of different ways. Like you mentioned a so-called Taylor law. I wanted to make sure we came back to that. So something that people were really shocked to learn last summer, really the end of last summer, but throughout last summer is that in New York, teachers union cannot go on strike. Like in Chicago and in other large cities, there was really a big emphasis on there being like, they were like, oh my gosh, there's going to be a strike. And then people were kind of assuming New York was part of that. Right. And you would have to say, oh no, not at all. And I mean, our leadership, I've been hesitating to get too much into like talking about the leadership of the UFT, but like the leadership of the UFT kind of like, I think realized it was in this like crisis of leadership and like actually would say like, if we have to go on strike, we will. Like, Mulgrew went on record saying that, and that the health and safety strike is an exception to this Taylor law, right? And it's, they would have to argue that out in court. It's not clear that a strike over health and safety issues would be allowed, right? Because there's a law in New York State that says that public sector employees cannot strike, and if they do, they can be fined. I believe there's like a floor on the fines that's in the millions, but it's like they can be totally cut down financially, and then
the head of the union is also put in jail right?
time. Yeah.
So he'd be having to argue that Mulgrew would have to argue that that case from jail. Yeah.
Well, and he'd first have to get out of jail. There'd be a criminal. Yeah. So, and the president of the Transit Workers Union actually was jailed after this law was passed because they had went on strike. They had reached an impasse when they were bargaining their contract with the city, and they went on strike, and their president served 3 days in jail. So that was this moment of like testing the law. I think the union at the Transit Workers Union was like, we have to see if they're really going to do it, if they're really serious, because like we are their constituents, like we are part of the political fabric of this state. Like, how can you do this to us? And they went ahead and enforced it. And it it was very, it had a big chilling effect. And we saw the effect of that. Like, we weren't willing to really, the union leadership was not willing to go that far.
Right.
And, you know, if you take a step back, we shouldn't have to be in that position, right?
Right.
You know, if the issue is compelled speech, right? Why does it only apply in one direction, right? So I believe that we should have refused to work, right? Under those conditions. Like,
Yeah,
I
people
supported
died.
a strike.
Yeah.
People died. Yeah, people died in early 2020, and people died throughout last year.
Yeah, in January there were I think 2 or 3 education workers who were added to the list of UFT people who died. Yeah.
Right. And so why am I then compelled not to exercise my speech in that way? Right? Is that somehow different? And people will argue, yeah, it is, for a variety of reasons we kind of already covered. But yeah, I mean, so that's kind of where these people fit into the current moment in labor law in the United States and in the state of New York. And they're trying to, you know, it's part of these outside efforts who are trying to gain traction now within the very movement itself.
Right.
Rather than just exerting external pressure, these groups are trying to infiltrate the actual unions.
Right, which in this case they've done.
Yeah.
Michael Caine is a teacher in Queens.
Right. Right.
And I think some of the other individuals involved on that steering committee are also, you know, they are teaching in DOE schools.
Right.
That's an interesting idea that, like, so the fact that they are willing to, because the union is in our interest, like it works on behalf of us, and that's how we get our salaries that we like. It's how we get our health benefits that we like, that I assume Michael Caine likes as well. I mean, you know, if he's had the time to set up this, you know, this WordPress website, that it means that he's, you know, probably not working a second job because he doesn't have to, because in New York City, teachers don't always have to work a second job like they do in much of the rest of the country, where where salaries are too low to afford a comfortable living for a teacher. So my question is, what happens if Michael Caine gets what he wants and enough people resign their membership in the UFT to actually make a difference? Like, first of all, how many would it have to be? And second of all, what then would the UFT do you think?
Yeah, that's that is the big question here, right? So what will happen if people stop paying for union membership? And there is, you know, in the social science of labor relations, there's this concept of like the collective bargaining problem, right? Where, you know, let's put everything aside, you know, and in theory, right? We have an employee and they want the power of collective bargaining, which they experience in terms of improved terms and conditions of employment. But they want to minimize their cost, right? So you can think of it in the economic sense of cost benefit, right? So like, I want to maximize my personal profits by minimizing the costs associated with getting the terms and conditions I want.
Right.
And the term for this is like a free rider. You know, there is a, you know, again, if we think about people that are acting in the quote unquote purely economic sense, right? Because like people are moral, people believe in like what's right or wrong, you know, and things like that. or what's fair or not. And, this is where like economic analysis kind of falls apart sometimes because there is no one who exists like this. But there is one factor that is included in the decision of like, get your job in the DOE. Do I become a dues paying member? Do I also pay for PAC? Or no, do I become an agency fee member? Or do I pay dues and not PAC? Like there are these like costs associated with the terms and conditions of employment that you have.
Right.
So there is a motivation in minimizing those costs, right? And the only thing that will kind of counteract that is like, in this theory, right, is like the idea that you believe in being a member, right? Or you believe in being fair. I shouldn't be a free rider. That's bad.
Right. Because not everybody can do that.
Right.
If everybody
My
does it, then you don't get
coworkers-
your bargaining.
Right. And well, the fact of the matter is that your coworkers are paying for it.
Right.
So your coworkers are incurring a cost. So what a person is doing when they're minimizing their cost in the situation is they're off-putting it onto their coworkers.
Right.
And it can be thought that they might be acting this way knowing that these other people are going to pay for it. Everybody else is paying for it. So if I don't, it's not a big deal. It's not going to erode my bargaining power, but it means that I gain more out of this situation than they do.
Right.
Right. So that is what people are kind of trying to appeal to here is like you want to get as much as you can out of this situation. Now, on the union side of it, it's like, okay, we have this cost of doing business, right? And, that big building in downtown Manhattan, how necessary is it? I don't know, personally.
Right.
There are reasons why these arguments are compelling. Like unions are not, and our union specifically is not free of blame on these things. And let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Totally necessary. They're paying the lowest rent they possibly could, and it's something that really is important and that serves a function for them to have that. Right.
And every room is as utilized as every room at my school.
Like, the other thing is like like I used to work with construction locals, like the iron workers local in Hartford, Connecticut is in like a small office, on like one floor of a bigger building. And they do a ton, they manage a fund, they are managing contracts for a bunch of different employers. Like they're doing they do a lot there too.
Yeah.
And I don't think their membership is the same exact size for that local because that union is organized differently. But if you're thinking about the kind of maintenance and the administration of a union of 1,500 teachers or more. I mean, how many teachers are in the DOE?
About 75,000 who are currently teaching, and then there are another approximately 75,000 retirees.
So it's way off. So, getting into the hundreds of thousands of people, right?
Yeah.
So I think, let's just say that whole building is necessary. But the optics of it might sometimes lead people to think like in this rhetoric going around and these small groups going around, making this part of the conversation and making people forget that, your lifestyle is funded and your working conditions are a result of this collective effort that we contribute to as members of the union. And I don't want someone else to do that. Like if we all should be paying to support it.
Right.
Because it needs to be paid to support.
Right.
Especially if you consider the real, like getting outside of like this abstract moral question, it's like the real cost of it, right? Like our union, there's a law that could put our union president in jail. It's a very urgent concern.
Right.
And I'm 100% on board with my union paying a lobbyist to go to Albany and say to politicians, you need to repeal this law. Yeah. This law needs to be repealed. Like I'm 100% on board with doing that. Is my union actually doing that? I don't know, frankly.
Hope so.
I hope so. And that's a little bit on me, right? I need to go ask. Because that's something else that kind of hinders unions' efforts, right? Because you can very easily, as a DOE employee, go to work and never think about your union.
Right.
Right? If you're not
Until
getting
you have
into,
a problem. And
right.
often you don't have a problem.
Yeah. If you don't have a problem, you've got a good relationship with everybody, and your administration is okay and they're not acting out of line, and you're not being harassed or discriminated against, like you might never think about the union, right? And you see the money that comes out for your pension, but you think, okay, I understand that's actually I'm paying myself, or the money that comes out for the welfare fund, okay, that's pays for my health benefits. Like, you might be totally copacetic with all of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you hear someone come along and say, why, like, start to put in your head these ideas that that you're being exploited by the organization that is helping to establish those terms and conditions for you.
Right.
And unless you have the union coming to you and showing you
what they do,
what they
got for you, and what they're working to get for you in the future.
Different schools have different levels of engagement. Like, I think my school is very engaged with the union. And I actually had, some tough conversations with people after Janus was decided.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, like, I had a list of like 10 or 15 people that I was asked to talk to. And like, the only reason that happened is because my chapter leader, the leader representing us at our school level, he and I are good friends. And he's a social studies teacher, which I've met multiple chapter leaders who are social studies teachers, and that always kind of makes sense to me. But it can be anybody, right? As long as you get elected by your coworkers
and have tenure.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, you actually don't have to have tenure,
right. But
which
it helps. It's a good idea.
It's a good idea, yeah. But anyway, he believed that we need to organize in our chapter, especially because like I had conversations with him where I'm like, we got to get we got to organize in our chapter. Like, if for no other reason than like we want to help our school to run better,
right?
But so we had these conversations, and like the vast majority of the conversations, I spoke to 3 people out of those 15 who I actually had to like kind of sit with and talk and like have what I considered like a real organizing conversation. Mm-hmm. And the other 12 were, it was a 30-second conversation.
They were on board.
Yeah. Like they were like, one teacher just very specifically was like, what do you mean not pay dues? Who's not paying dues? Like, she wasn't even really like, she had something else on her mind that day, obviously, but she was even just like, oh yeah, that's so dumb. Like, even just paying agency fees. She's like, no, I support the union.
Yeah.
So, that was a relief, but it is concerning to think that, there is this motivation that exists to not do it. And now there is this legal protection for people that don't want to do it.
Right.
And you're kind of compelling the speech of the union in that way. Because what would happen in the past, right, before, like in the older times in history I was referring to, before like the legal institution of union membership became a reality in the United States, if you didn't want to be in the union, I mean, no one can stop you from working there, but like, you can't, like, you're not going to work for the same benefits as us.
Right.
Like, you're not going to get that benefit. And like, we're also not going to, like, there's a lot of social pressure. And this is where some of the dark things that have happened in labor history have happened too. Like, people, there's a reason why this issue is the way it is. Like, people were hurt, by members of unions who were like, you can't work for that. You're eroding the benefits for all of us.
Right.
And then, so that we don't want mob rule by any stretch of the imagination, but it's like you're taking from your coworkers when you do that, right? Like, we are contributing to this thing that benefits all of us, and you should contribute to it too, because it benefits you.
Right. And
so,
if enough of us don't contribute to it, then all of a sudden we don't have all of these things that we like to have.
Yeah. So that's a real hard question to answer. Like, when you ask me what will happen, So we kind of saw what would happen after the decision came out and the UFT did what seemed to me to be like, at least in my tenure at the DOE, was the only true internal organizing effort I'd ever seen from the union.
Right.
Like I had phone banked for the union a couple of times, and my chapter leader had asked me to do that and was like, chapter leader's very active about like keeping us engaged with the union. We have a delegate that he's such a saint. He sends us like typewritten transcripts of the delegate assemblies.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So we have a pretty hooked in chapter, which I appreciate and I like. But it was just around this one issue and it was just for like a week, Meanwhile, when I was working for 1199 in Connecticut, like I was an internal organizer. So that was a private sector union, a private and public, actually. They represented both because it was a healthcare union.
Okay.
And so they had a group of organizers who were going out and trying to get people to join the union, to form unions at their workplaces. And they also had a team of people who were representatives of the union to the members, who they could bring their complaints to, and people, and the job was to foster engagement with the union. And, there are always tensions that exist, right? Because there are people who get into positions of power and they want to maintain that power. And so sometimes what, people might be asked to do is just to kind of like get people to step in line. And then the other times it was just like, no, like, this is a problem you're having at your workplace. Like, let's figure out what we can do collectively to solve that problem. Like it's, so that is not something that does exist in the UFT. Should it exist? That's a good question too. Like chapter leaders are a huge element of your interface with the union, right? Your chapter leader and your delegates are your school level point of contact with the union.
Right.
And so like the union has an interest in like fostering people who are going to do that, who have an organizer mindset. And whether they do it or not, it seems like they try, but it's an institutional mindset of kind of, it's sort of a lax institutional mindset where it's just like, okay, you got to be part of the union. And so we want to have a good, strong union, but it's like, we're not pushing too aggressively,
Right.
But I think also, it's a healthy thing for you to have a rank and file movement within your union.
Absolutely.
Sometimes those were kind of looked at very skeptically, as like an aspect of like outside agitation within a union. Like people were worried, I think, that rank and file movements were like, people have been accused of, being communist agitators or, or even like right-wing
infiltrators,
people,
of some sort, yeah.
right? And it's funny because they're, for the most part, most rank and file movements, all the ones that I'm aware of, they're members who want to just have a union that runs well.
Right.
And that's a healthy thing for you to have people in leadership who care about running it well, to have members engaged with it. Like that's what you want. So we really, what the UFT seems to want to do is foster engagement, which is good. But how successful have their efforts been? I'm not exactly sure. Yeah. But it seems like, at least from the point of view of my chapter, people were mostly totally on board with continuing their union membership and understanding that if their union membership stopped, and this is the question that is really hard for me to answer, what happens?
Yeah.
So what happens if the UFT, like, if no one is paying for it anymore, will this, because the city could just say, okay, well, this organization is defunct, and so we don't recognize the contract anymore, so we're just going to unilaterally set conditions. I think that's really unlikely. I think that it's really unlikely that it goes that way.
Yeah, especially over an issue with, a constituency of 100 people.
Yeah,
That's something that I want to return to, this idea of rank and file movements and pressing the union for what you want in a democratic fashion, right? Because that's sort of at the core of a rank and file movement is this idea that we are through democratic means, we can get what we want and get what we need from our organization, which is, also an organization that is there for the purpose of getting us what we need through collective bargaining and that sort of thing. So is there, and I want to give Mr. Kane the benefit of the doubt just for a minute, and say like, well, maybe he actually is wanting just to get something that he feels he needs from his union. Meanwhile, 80%, 90% of the constituency of the UFT wants the opposite, right? We are either neutral or we are very much in favor of a vaccine mandate because it's going to keep us safe. It's going to keep the kids safe. It's going to keep the kids' families safe, which is a big point that I haven't heard addressed or, by Mr. Kane or by anybody else involved with Teachers for Choice.
Right.
So what is the recourse within? Because the thing is, the union isn't requiring the mandate or isn't requiring the vaccine. The union made it possible for us to get the vaccine when we got it, which was,
right.
A little bit before a lot of the rest of the city. Because we were working and we were in contact with people who were potentially exposed. And so the union facilitated our getting the vaccine. But it's the city that is requiring the vaccine, the city that's mandating the vaccine. So, he's not leaving the city that's employing him. He's not leaving his DOE job, which is the reason he's having to get the vaccine. He's staying in that job, but he is trying to, or he is, leaving the union, which is just there to try and, protect our rights, right? So can we give him the benefit of the doubt on that? Where's the reason?
So, I'm really glad that you brought this up because you're doing something that I think that I, so far in the conversation, have failed to do, which is really one of the keys to having an organizing conversation in any context, like union or political, any kind of context. When you have someone who has a belief that is going against their own interest, but they believe that it's in their own, that it is in their interest, right? So, you have to take them at their word if you're going to have that conversation. Like if Mr. Kane was here talking to us, I wasn't really thinking about his stated reasons for not paying union dues anymore because I really immediately saw how nonsensical that is. Because as you say, the UFT hasn't mandated anybody to do anything, right? It's the city has. And what he's trying to say is he's displeased with how the union has represented him when the city has made this change to the terms of employment. Right.
Meanwhile, the UFT has represented 90% plus of its membership, which is in direct opposition to his supposed interests. Right.
And that's kind of, that's where they start bringing up totalitarianism because they're like, the tyranny of the majority, right? Like I'm an oppressed minority within this union. Like my health rights are not being, respected. That's kind of how this ties in with their rhetoric.
Tyranny of the majority would be a great name for probably a new metal band. Late 90s, early aughts.
Oh yeah. Oh boy. Yeah, just real harsh sounding. And like, but all of the lyrics are all about like, washing your hands and being polite and not spreading your legs on the subway and things like that.
6 feet distance.
Yeah. It's all just about like just collective good things, like, like don't litter and don't speed and things like that.
And pay your dues.
Yeah, and pay your dues. Yeah. It's great. I just love imagining what that would sound like. So he you want to talk to people and you want to meet them where they're at, because if you come at them with an attitude of of aggression or just frustration, or if they don't feel like you're listening to them, then they won't. They won't listen to you. They won't talk to you, and they'll just continue what they're doing. So,
and it's sort of the expectation too. It's what they've been told, maybe by Fox News or whatever. Like, yeah, your grandkids, they're gonna anyway.
Returning to that. So let's talk. I didn't really mention like who is Janice, right? In Janice versus AFSCME. Janice, we talked about how he was a social worker working for a state agency. Okay, so Janice is also now employed by a right-wing think tank. And that lawsuit was funded by the right-wing think tank that employed him. He left his job because he didn't want to pay the agency fees.
Right. And honestly, like based on his reasoning, working that job was if the problem is that someone is talking to a democratically elected government, and that's your problem, then working that job is actually just as much you are in breach of your own. You have silenced yourself.
Yeah. So the other side of it is there is very good reason to not take someone like Mr. Kane at his word,
because he might be angling for a think tank job.
Right. Not only that, but he is like this group that he started is funded by that kind of a group, you know,
and reciprocally funding because they have the donations link up on their website. So
there's a difference between like we can't engage with someone like Michael Caine, right? Right? Is that his name?
Yeah.
He's not acting in good faith, right? But those voices of those teachers at that rally, like those are the people that we have to talk to.
Right.
And, part of that conversation should, of course, be the DOE is the one doing this.
Right.
And if your
the mayor's office.
Yeah, the mayor's office. And not only that, but like, yeah, so it is a change to our terms and conditions of employment.
Yeah.
But the majority of us are in favor of it.
Right.
And if you're going to choose, I mean, honestly, I don't know what result they really want because, okay, let's say the UFT joins that lawsuit trying to stop the vaccine mandate. Will you rejoin? Will you start paying dues again?
Right.
I mean, that would be my first question.
And
what would it take for you to start paying dues again?
Right.
And the answer for, I think, someone like Caine is like, really nothing in the end. Probably wouldn't come out and admit that, but that's really what it is, nothing.
Right.
But I think there are people, when you start asking that question, they'll start to realize like, oh yeah, why did I choose to stop? I mean, yeah, it doesn't make sense. Like,
I'm sorry, I was mad.
Because what you want them to do is bargain on your behalf.
Yeah.
And you're saying, well, they're not. And I'm like, well, okay, so this is not how they're going to listen to you. And then even if it was like, if enough people go along with you, then there will be no one to listen to you anyway.
Right.
And the vaccine mandate will still be there regardless.
Right.
Right. So, it's a really embarrassing situation where you have people like claiming to speak for the union. And this, I get frustrated with, the news media for talking about the union that I'm a member of like this too, because those people don't represent me.
Absolutely not. No.
Like it's one thing if they say Michael Mulgrew, and like Michael Mulgrew literally is an elected representative of me. Like I'll come out and say like I voted for him the last time there was an election. Like I'm going to be thinking about my vote a little bit differently this time around. But like, yeah, he is my representative. But these random folks on the street just claiming like why are they not digging into this?
Right. I would really like it if in the next protest, someone would go around and like ask to see DOE identification or something like that, because I looking around my building, looking around professional developments that I go to that are citywide, I don't see these people.
No. And I even, it's it's also not even just work that you would have to necessarily do as a reporter on the ground talking to people. Like, of course, you got to ask those questions. Like, who paid for that PA?
Yeah.
Like, you rented that platform. Like, who paid for that? Who paid for these workers to come in and set up that stage? Those are great questions to ask on the spot. But then, like, doing journalism of like going and finding, okay, there's this organization. Do they have an LLC associated? Like, there's money passing through it? How do you follow that money? And like that is what the media should be doing. Like, you can't just I understand deadlines and needing to report on things, but like, unless you know that they represent teachers, like, just saying, oh, these are teachers without clarifying, like, this is a small group speaking for themselves.
Right.
It's unfortunate, but that's a bigger media issue.
Right. And one that that was kind of the start of this show, was like, there's a lot being said about teachers. There are not many teachers doing that talking. And also there's a lot of stuff that teachers need to know that very few people are answering questions about
Right.
in a concise and clear way.
Right.
Early on in the story of this Teachers for Choice organization, the problem was that the vaccine was experimental. And then upon the approval, the FDA approval of the vaccine, radio silence from the organization.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And then early on with the problem was that Mulgrew was not responding stringently enough to the updated elements of our contract where we have to get the vaccine. And then he did. But then that wasn't enough either. There was a press release on, if you can call it a press release, again, it's just on a WordPress site, on the 4th of September, which was 2 days ago, saying like, nope, not good enough. We don't believe him.
Because nothing really would be. I mean, yeah, as we've discussed, yeah. There's no point at which they would become dues-paying members again. Like, there's nothing he could ever do, right? And it's not even like, would he do it? It's like, there's nothing he could ever do. So, I just feel like sometimes we give these voices a little bit too much space.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the problem of like this majority of people who are like vaccinated and ready to go back. Cause it's like, last year when we were talking about doing the reopening, like, and people were like, well, can I be forced to wear a mask and all this other stuff? And Mulger's having to answer a lot of these questions. And that was a moment where I felt like there was good leadership, like on that issue where it's like, I'm sorry, caller to the UFT town hall, like you do have to wear a mask, like at work, and no, you cannot take it off in front of kids, and no, a face shield alone is not enough, but yes, they will be provided for you. And if it's not, then you need to file a complaint with us, like at the district level or higher. And that, and I feel like there's other things they did not lead us effectively on, but we give too much airtime to vaccine and mask skeptics.
Right.
Just in general, I guess it's not not solely an issue for the UFT, but
right. There's something about it that I say this now that we are almost 2 hours into
sorry, we went way long
into giving them air. No, this is great, and I'll trim it down so we'll be fine. But I think that there is some, and I bounced back and forth on whether or not to even cover this topic, because it is just 100 people, if that, and the padding that is going onto their petition. The padding being people who are not at all impacted by by the mandate, and probably not even in New York, probably on the internet in like Milwaukee or something, signing a petition to try and get something to happen with this mandate. So like, why even talk about it? But I think that it is important to identify and label, especially in the case of astroturfing, which I think is likely what we're seeing here, if not 100% what we're seeing here. You have to label it so that people realize, no, that's not a teacher thing. Teachers are just trying to go in and teach and do a good job in a safe situation. That is part of a culture war that has nothing to do with what we're doing. And so let's identify it. Let's cut off the head of the snake right away and move on to something that is a little bit more meaningful, which is this broader pattern that we're a part of right now as laborers in the union, but has been the story of like labor relations in American history from the mid 1800s on. I think that's why that's why you cover it, and also the typos are funny.
Yeah, there is an effort, I think, that we, everyone can make to just like show who these people really are, like just show how ridiculous they are, even in their very presentation, and to take them seriously, but to also just point out that it's like it's honestly a pathetic attempt to get people to give up something that benefits them. Yeah. And it's part of this broader conversation, and people talk about like unions and union membership as if like it's only for certain people, and like, no, everybody, we not only can and should everyone's entitled to form a union in their workplace. That is the law of this country, at least now.
Right.
That right has been eroded significantly.
Yeah.
But it is everyone's right to do that. And it's in your interest to not only work toward that for yourself, but also to support other people that are doing it, because the rising tide lifts all boats. Like, that's just like an old slogan you hear in the organized labor movement. Like, the unions do a lot of work in establishing the floor of wages, and that's an important role that unions play in society. Everyone has an interest in supporting it.
Absolutely. So I think that's the perfect place to end it there. So, Jeff, happy Labor Day.
Yeah, happy Labor Day, Noah. What a great way to celebrate it.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great.